fame promises a kind of protection. The people the whole world watches seem to move through life on a different plane, insulated by money, by talent, by the sheer weight of public attention that follows them everywhere they go. We imagine that if death comes for them at all, it will come in some grand or fitting way. A long illness mourned in headlines, an old age spent among admirers. But death does not read the credits. Sometimes it arrives through the smallest and strangest of doors. A length of silk, a gust of bad luck on a film set, a fall that should have meant nothing, a fish in shallow water, a tumble on a beginner's slope. The accidents that killed the people in this story were not the violent ends anyone would have predicted for them. They were freak events, improbable collisions of circumstance that turned ordinary moments into catastrophes in the space of a heartbeat. Here are 5 celebrities who died in freak accidents. It was the evening of September 14th, 1927, in the city of Nice on the French Riviera, where Isadora Duncan had made a home among the artists and expatriates who gathered along the Mediterranean coast. She was 50 years old and one of the most famous performers in the world, an American-born dancer who had spent her life tearing down the rules of her art and building something new in their place. Where classical ballet was rigid, vertical, and corseted, Duncan danced barefoot in loose, flowing tunics, her movements drawn from the rhythms of the sea and the poses of ancient Greek vases. She is remembered as a pioneer of modern dance, a woman who insisted that the body should move as nature intended rather than as tradition demanded, and her influence ran through the whole of 20th century performance. She had toured the great cities of Europe and the Americas, founded schools, taken lovers and patrons, buried 2 of her own children in an earlier tragedy, and lived always at full volume, dramatic and uncompromising to the last. By the autumn of 1927, she was past the peak of her performing years, her fortunes uncertain, but her name still carried the weight of legend wherever she went. She remained the woman who had freed dance from its cage, and on the Riviera she was a familiar figure, theatrical in dress and gesture, the kind of person whose every entrance and exit seemed to be performed for an audience. On that warm evening, she prepared to ride in an open-top DeMille car, a small French sports car, driven by a young mechanic named Benoit Falchetto. By most accounts, it was a test drive, a chance to try out the machine, and Duncan settled into the passenger seat in characteristic style. Around her neck, she had draped a long, hand-painted silk shawl, the kind of dramatic accessory she favored, its fringe trailing, loose and long. Friends who saw her off would later recall the famous flourish with which she called out to them as the car prepared to leave, wrapped in the very garment that was about to kill her. As the DeMille car pulled away from the curb, the trailing end of the silk shawl swept down toward the rear of the car and caught in the spokes of a rear wheel and the axle beneath it. The fabric, wound tight in an instant by the turning wheel, cinched hard around her neck. There was no time to react. The shawl broke her neck and dragged her bodily from her seat, pulling her out of the moving car and onto the cobblestones of the street. She was killed almost instantly. The car had not crashed. There had been no collision, no other vehicle, no high speed, nothing that anyone would recognize as a road accident. Isadora Duncan had been killed by her own clothing, by a fashionable length of painted silk, and the simple physics of a spinning wheel. The strangeness of her death gave it a long afterlife. The writer, Gertrude Stein, a contemporary, is credited with the wry observation that the episode proved affectations can be dangerous. Her end passed into legend as the definitive example of the freak accident, the kind of death so improbable and so bound up with the personality of its victim that it seemed almost to have been scripted. Even medicine took note. The danger of long neckwear becoming entangled in machinery is sometimes referred to in the medical literature as Isadora Duncan syndrome, a clinical phrase carrying the name of a dancer dead for a century. She had spent her life turning the human body into art, and in the end, a trailing scarf and a moving wheel undid her in a moment, on an ordinary street, on a warm evening by the sea. It was March 30th, 1993, in Wilmington, North Carolina, on the set of a film called The Crow. Brandon Lee was 28 years old, a rising actor stepping out of one of the longest shadows in Hollywood. He was the son of Bruce Lee, the martial arts icon whose own early death had become the stuff of legend, and Brandon had spent years working to establish himself as a performer in his own right, rather than merely an inheritor of a famous name. The Crow was meant to be the film that did it, a dark, gothic thriller in which he played a murdered man returned from the grave to avenge himself and his fiancée. The role suited him, brooding and physical and stylish, and those who worked with him believed it would make him a star. He had trained in martial arts like his father, carried himself with the same easy athleticism, and had begun to assemble the kind of body of work that would let him be judged on his own terms. He was engaged to be married, and his life off the set seemed to be falling into place at the same moment his career was. By that spring, the production was nearly finished, with only a handful of scenes left to shoot. The scene being filmed was a flashback in which Lee's character is shot by a group of thugs as he enters his apartment. It called for one of the actors, Michael Massey, to fire a revolver at Lee from a distance of about 15 feet. The gun was a .44 Magnum, and for the scene it was loaded with blanks, cartridges that produced the noise and muzzle flash of a real gunshot without firing a projectile. This is routine work on a film set, performed thousands of times without harm, but a chain of small failures had quietly turned the prop into a lethal weapon. Earlier in the production, the crew had needed dummy rounds, inert cartridges that look real on camera for close-up shots of the loaded cylinder. Rather than obtain proper dummies, someone had made them by taking live cartridges, removing the gunpowder, and leaving the rest of the round intact, including the primer, the small explosive cap that ignites the main charge. During an earlier shot, one of these improvised dummy rounds had been fired. The primer, still live, had enough force to push the bullet out of its casing and partway up the barrel, where it lodged and stayed unnoticed. In the language of firearms, this is called a squib load, an obstruction left sitting in the bore. When Massey raised the revolver and fired the blank at Lee, the blank had no bullet of its own, but it had a full charge of gas. That charge drove into the back of the lodged fragment and launched it down the barrel and out of the gun with nearly the force of a live round. It struck Brandon Lee in the abdomen. To everyone present, it looked at first like the scene playing out as written, an actor falling under gunfire, until it became clear that he was not getting up. He was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons worked on him for roughly 6 hours. The damage was beyond repair. On March 31st, 1993, Brandon Lee was pronounced dead. He was 28 years old. The death was ruled an accident, the product of negligence rather than malice, and no criminal charges were brought against anyone involved. Massey, who had simply pulled the trigger as the scene required, was devastated and spoke of the event with anguish for the rest of his life. Lee's mother later sued the filmmakers, and the case was settled. The Crow was completed using a combination of existing footage, a stand-in, and early digital effects, and it was released to become a cult favorite, forever shadowed by the knowledge of how its star had died. For decades afterward, Brandon Lee's name returned to public conversation whenever a firearm caused tragedy on a set, most painfully after the 2021 shooting on the film Rust, when a live round again ended a life during what was supposed to be make-believe. The lesson of the squib load, learned at such cost in 1993, had to be learned again. It was May 23, 1999, at the Kemper Arena in Kansas City, Missouri, where the World Wrestling Federation was staging a pay-per-view event called Over the Edge. Owen Hart was one of the most respected performers in the business, a member of the legendary Hart wrestling family of Calgary, Canada, a clan that had produced champions and trainers and shaped professional wrestling for generations. Owen was a gifted athlete, quick and technically brilliant, beloved backstage as a gentle family man and an incorrigible prankster, the opposite in private of the villains he sometimes played in the ring. On this night, he was performing as the Blue Blazer, a comedic superhero character he wore as a kind of affectionate parody, complete with cape and mask. The character came with a theatrical entrance. Rather than walking down to the ring, the Blue Blazer was to descend from the rafters of the arena, lowered on a harness and cable from high above the crowd like a bumbling, caped crusader. The plan called for him to be brought down to a point a few feet above the mat and then released, dropping the last short distance to the canvas as a piece of physical comedy. It was a stunt built on a quick-release mechanism attached to his vest, the kind of rigging used in theatrical productions, and it depended entirely on that mechanism doing exactly what it was supposed to do and nothing more. It did not. As Owen Hart hung suspended high above the ring, waiting for his cue, the quick release triggered early. The latch that was meant to free him only at the bottom of his descent let go while he was still near the top, roughly 90 feet above the mat. He fell. There was nothing to slow him and nothing to catch him. He came down chest first onto the top rope of the ring, the impact driving into his torso, and then slammed into the ring below. The force of the fall severed his aorta, the great artery carrying blood from the heart, and he began to bleed to death internally where he lay. A particular and haunting circumstance surrounded the moment. The live broadcast had cut away to a pre-taped interview segment in the seconds before the fall, so the millions watching at home did not see Owen Hart drop, but the thousands of fans inside the Kemper Arena saw all of it, watched the costumed figure plunge from the ceiling and crash into the ring, and many at first could not tell whether it was part of the show. It was not. Medical personnel rushed to him and worked desperately, and he was taken from the arena, but the internal bleeding was catastrophic. About 33 minutes after the fall, Owen Hart was pronounced dead. He was in the prime of his life and his career. The decision to continue the event after his death drew lasting criticism, and the grief inside the industry was immense. Owen's widow, Martha Hart, brought a lawsuit against the WWF, arguing that the stunt had been recklessly planned and that her husband should never have been asked to perform it. The case was settled, with reported figures around $18 million, and Martha became a determined advocate against the kind of risk-taking that had cost her husband his life. The accident reshaped how the industry approached aerial stunts and rigging, ushering in greater caution about the elaborate entrances that had become part of the spectacle. Owen Hart was remembered not for the comic character he was playing when he died, but for the warmth and skill that had made him so loved. A man killed by a piece of hardware that failed at the worst possible instant, in front of a live crowd that would never forget it. He had built his name on a reputation for safety, known throughout the locker room as a careful and protective performer who looked after the people he worked with in the ring. That he should die not from a wrestling move but from a theatrical stunt rigged above the canvas struck many in the business as a particularly bitter irony, and his memory has been honored at events bearing his name ever since. It was September 4th, 2006, at Bat Reef, off the coast of Port Douglas in Queensland, Australia, on the warm tropical waters of the Great Barrier Reef. Steve Irwin was 44 years old and one of the most recognizable people on the planet, the irrepressible Australian conservationist known to a global audience as the Crocodile Hunter. With his khaki shirts, his boundless enthusiasm, and his trademark cry of delight at every dangerous animal he encountered, he had turned wildlife documentary into something electric and personal. He wrestled crocodiles, handled venomous snakes, and threw himself into the natural world with a fearless joy that made millions of viewers feel they were right beside him. He was also a serious conservationist who used his fame to fund and promote the protection of wild places and animals, and he ran the Australia Zoo with his family as the center of his life's work. On that day, he was filming a documentary, working in the waters off Bat Reef. The production was for a program titled Ocean's Deadliest, focused on the perilous creatures of the sea. The weather had been rough and uncooperative, and during a lull, Irwin decided to make use of the calm by going snorkeling in shallow, chest-deep water to capture some additional footage for a separate children's program he was making with his daughter. It was light, opportunistic filming, the kind of thing he had done countless times, in water shallow enough to stand in. In those shallows, he came upon a large, short-tailed stingray, a broad, flat creature perhaps 2 meters across, resting on the bottom. Stingrays are generally placid animals that pose little threat to people, and Irwin approached this one from behind, planning to film it as it swam away, an unremarkable shot of a graceful animal moving off through the water. But something about the encounter alarmed the ray. It may have perceived the shadow of Irwin above and behind it as the shape of a predator, a shark moving in to attack from the rear. Whatever the trigger, the animal did not flee. It reared up and lashed out, striking repeatedly and violently with its tail, which carried a long, serrated, venomous barb. The barb drove into Steve Irwin's chest. It struck with such force and in such a place that it pierced his heart. At first, he seemed not to grasp how badly he had been hurt. He reportedly believed the barb had punctured a lung, a serious but survivable wound, and pulled it free himself. But the injury to his heart was mortal, and he bled to death within minutes. There, in the shallow water he had entered so casually. The crew pulled him aboard and performed CPR, racing the boat toward Low Isles in a desperate effort to reach help, but nothing could be done. He was pronounced dead, and the news traveled around the world within hours. What made the death so singular, beyond the global fame of its victim, was its sheer improbability. Fatal stingray attacks on humans are extraordinarily rare, and Irwin had spent his entire life in the company of animals far more obviously lethal, crocodiles and venomous snakes and sharks, only to be killed by one of the ocean's more docile inhabitants in water he could stand up in. The whole event had been captured on camera by the film crew, making it, by widespread account, the only known stingray fatality recorded on video, footage that was never released to the public and was reportedly destroyed at the family's wish. The outpouring of grief was enormous and worldwide, an unusual depth of public mourning for a man whose entire career had been an open-armed invitation to love the wild and dangerous creatures that, in the end, took his life through the most unlikely of them. It was March the 16th, 2009, at the Mont Tremblant ski resort in Quebec, Canada, roughly 130 kilometers north of Montreal, on a gentle slope meant for beginners. Natasha Richardson was 45 years old, a celebrated British actress and a member of one of the great dynasties of the English-speaking stage and screen, the Redgrave family. She had won a Tony Award for her performance in the Broadway revival of Cabaret and built a distinguished career across theater and film. She was married to the actor Liam Neeson, with whom she had 2 sons, and she divided a full and accomplished life between her work and her family. At Mont Tremblant, she was simply on holiday, taking a beginner skiing lesson on an easy trail, the sort of low-stakes outing that thousands of people enjoy without incident every winter day. During the lesson, she fell. It happened on a gentle slope, at low speed, the kind of tumble that beginners take constantly as they learn, and she was not wearing a helmet. To everyone watching, and to Richardson herself, it seemed like nothing at all. She got up, she walked, she talked, she laughed about the fall and waved off any concern, and when emergency responders were summoned as a precaution, she declined medical attention, insisting she was fine. By every outward sign, she had simply stumbled and risen again, embarrassed at worst, and she returned to her room. There was no blood, no obvious wound, no sign that anything serious had occurred inside her skull, but something had. The blow to her head, mild as it appeared, had begun a slow bleed between her skull and the covering of her brain. For an hour or two she felt well, the deceptive interval that makes this kind of injury so treacherous. Then came a severe headache, and her condition began to deteriorate with frightening speed. What had looked like a harmless fall revealed itself as a mortal injury that had been quietly worsening the entire time. She was taken to a hospital in Montreal, and as the gravity of her state became clear, she was flown to Lenox Hill Hospital in New York City, where her family gathered. The bleeding had compressed her brain beyond recovery. On March 18, 2009, 2 days after a fall on a beginner's slope, Natasha Richardson died. She was 45 years old. The cause was the epidural hematoma produced by the blunt impact to her head, and her death was ruled accidental. For the public, it was almost impossible to absorb. She had not crashed at speed, had not struck a tree, or gone off a cliff. She had fallen gently on an easy run, stood up unharmed, and spoken and joked in the minutes afterward, and that ordinary moment had killed her. Her death became one of the most widely cited examples of what doctors grimly call a talk-and-die injury, a head trauma in which the victim seems lucid and fine in the immediate aftermath, only to collapse as bleeding inside the skull takes its toll. In the wake of her death, conversations about the importance of ski helmets and about the urgent need for medical evaluation after any head injury reached an enormous audience. The lesson was as stark as it was painful. A blow to the head can be fatal even when the person walks away talking, and the time to seek help is before the symptoms come. not after. A gentle fall on a beginner's slope, declined with a laugh, had taken the life of an acclaimed actress in the fullness of her career, and left behind a warning that has saved lives in the years since. 5 people, 5 lives lived at the height of public attention, undone not by the dangers anyone feared for them, but by accidents no one could have foreseen. A scarf, a flawed cartridge, a faulty latch, a frightened fish, a fall that looked like nothing. Each of them had survived far greater risks than the one that finally found them, and that is the quiet horror at the center of every freak accident. The catastrophe does not announce itself. It hides inside the ordinary, the everyday gesture, the routine moment, waiting for the one improbable arrangement of circumstances that turns it lethal. Fame could not protect them, and neither, in the end, could caution. The accident simply came, through the smallest of doors, and the world was left to remember how strangely they arrived.